Hey crew, it's Pitt, and I am back with some more Esoterica. Today we are diving back into the works of Mr. Manly Hall. This is the Secret Teachings of All Ages. We are up to yet another one that is probably going to ruffle some feathers that I haven't ruffled yet. Islam was not my faith, so I haven't spent a lot of time dealing with it. I have dealt with Christianity in some extensive manner because it was my faith. And I spend a lot of time talking about my current faith, but I haven't really dealt with many of the other ones yet. It is definitely something we are going to get to, but I am not fully versed in Islam. I have read through the Quran back many years ago, and like many other books, I thought I knew the things that were contained therein, but I may not actually know the things contained therein. I was never an extensive scholar of Islam to begin with, and so I don't have, in my anticipation, a lot to add to this particular study today. I will probably step on some toes because there are things that I know that other people don't, and they don't like it when I talk about that. So if you are unfamiliar with me, any of my unconventional beliefs, or if at any point in time I lose you in the terminology or you have no clue about which I am talking, there are several playlists linked in the corner up here and in the box down below, along with the source material so that you can get a clearer understanding of who I am and why I stand in the particular places that I do. I stand there pretty firmly, and I have a lot of reasons for them. A particular note, again today, is probably going to be the Unconventional Bible Study, where I have 161 videos dedicated to my journey from Christian to most definitely not. And if any of that made you not want to watch along, that is perfectly fine. Have a blessed day. But for everybody else, let's dive in and start discussing, which is what we're doing. We're reading along and discussing as we go along the various topics that are brought to light by the text. The faith of Islam. Let's go. Now, he did not represent Christianity in the way that Christianity represents itself, so I do not expect him to represent Islam in the way that Islam represents itself. If you happen to get mad about that, you are more than welcome to try to Charlie Hebdo me, but I am not some journalist sitting around in a coffee shop. I promise you that. If your feelings get hurt by anything I say here today, you are more than welcome to bring it up. My God does not disallow self-defense in any way, shape, or form. Keep it in mind. Representative of the attitude of Christendom towards Islam, till recent years at least, is Alexander Ross's postscript to the Anglicized version, published in 1649 of Sieur du Rier's French translation of the Quran. The author of the postscript directs the following invective against Muhammad and the Quran. Good reader. The great Arabian impostor, now, at last, after 1,000 years, is by the way of France, arrived in England, and his Al-Quran, or Gallimaufry of errors, a brat as deformed as the parent and as full of heresies as his scald head was full of scurvy, hath learned to speak English. If you will take a brief view of the Al-Quran, you shall find it a hodgepodge made up of these four ingredients: of contradictions, of blasphemy, of ridiculous fables, and of lies. I'm going to go ahead and pause right here because if you are unfamiliar with me or any of my unconventional beliefs, you would understand that I hold this for the Bible, for the Old Testament and the New Testament together. It is full of contradictions, often within the same chapter. It is full of blasphemy, and it is called righteous in many ways. It is full of ridiculous fables, if you don't believe in the supernatural, and of lies, absolutely, in many, many occasions, which we have outlined in some extensive detail in 161 videos. So I understand that you will not agree with the things that I am saying, but unless you have watched 161 videos as to why I say these things, I am most likely not going to respond to your comments about how I am wrong. Right? You were going to come at me and talk, well, did you consider dispensation? It's like, yes, I absolutely have considered the thing that almost everybody believes. I have considered most of the arguments. You probably do not have a new one. You might. You're more than welcome to leave them. If it remains respectful, by all means, leave your comments. But if I don't respond, it is because I have already considered the thing that you are arguing for. And explained it. And again, it's not just that I considered it and dismissed it. It is I've considered it and discussed it at some great length in the playlist. I have. The accusation of blasphemy is emphasized against Muhammad because he affirmed that God, being unmarried, was incapable of having a son. The fallacious argument, however, is apparent from the Prophet's own views of the nature of God as contained in the second surah of the Quran. To Allah, God, belongeth the east and the west. Therefore, whithersoever ye turn yourselves to pray, there is the face of Allah, for Allah is omnipresent and omniscient. They say, Allah hath begotten children. Allah forbid. To him belongeth whatever is in heaven and on earth. All is possessed by him, the creator of heaven and earth. And when he decreeth a thing, he only saith unto it, Be, and it is. In other words, the God of Islam has but to desire, and the object of that desire at once comes into being, whereas the God of Alexander, Ross, must proceed in accordance with the laws of human generation. I absolutely agree with that. I do not believe in the physical incarnation of God on the planet. I believe that God is all things. He is me, he is you, he is the space between me and you and the space between me and you. He is everything you can see and he is everything that you cannot. And being such, in such large grand scope, he cannot manifest within himself. It is literally like the only requirement is you can't become inside of you, right? Anything that is inside of you is already automatically a part of you. It cannot be the fullness of you, and therefore there can be no incarnation here. There can, however, be people who represent the will of God, who have been directly revealed to from God through a spiritual process. I do believe that. I believe that there are prophets and that they are led to lead their people up from the surroundings into something better. That doesn't mean that they were correct 100%. That is a hard concept for some people, but it is not for me. Man is fallible. Anything that man does that will therefore be fallible. Any control system placed is by nature going to be flawed because it has to come through the interpretation of a man, and man is fundamentally flawed. That doesn't mean that you can't aspire to better. It doesn't mean that you can't identify better and try to do that. I believe that that is, in part, what the control systems are doing. And when I say control system, what I mean is the current religions, all of them writ large, whether it is Islam or whether it is Methodism or whether it is Baptist or Catholic or Judaic, whoever it is, however it is, if it is a written down procedure on how to deal with God, it is probably incorrect. That includes the things that I say, right? I try to give my best interpretation of the things God has revealed to me in the clearest terms possible without all the rituals and procedures that have been added onto them by all of these control systems. But I can be wrong. The system in which I use has proven effective for me and in small measure for some other people. But that does not mean that it is the end-all be-all of all things. I fully believe that I can be wrong. I do believe I am on the right path. I do believe that I am relaying accurate information. This is why I am doing it. But there is the possibility that I am incorrect. I don't believe that God had a child. I do not believe that that child had to die in order for you to be forgiven from sin. I believe that is just a little bit silly. The more I study it, the more I think about it, the more time I spend, the more silly it becomes. That the all-powerful, omniscient, omnipresent God is restricted from forgiving you unless you call upon this one particular name is a little bit wild. The fact that if you die not knowing that name, you're going to be condemned to hell is really wild, right? Even though not everybody believes that. Some people believe, well, you didn't know. That's the dispensationalism. No. It is very simple. If you ask God for forgiveness, God forgives you. It is really that simple. That requires a change from you. It requires you to do something different with your life. But God is. He is much, much bigger than any doctrine that has been recorded. Any of them. All right. That's where I stand. Muhammad, prophet of Islam, the desired of all nations, was born in Mecca, AD 570, and died in Medina, AD 632, or in the 11th year after the Hijrah. Washington Irving thus describes the signs and wonders accompanying the birth of the prophet. His mother suffered none of the pangs of travail. At the moment of his coming into the world, a celestial light illumined the surrounding country, and a newborn child, raising his eyes to heaven, exclaimed, "God is great. There is no God but God, and I am his prophet." Bullshit. Heaven and earth, we are assured, were agitated at his advent. The lake Sawa shrank back into its secret springs, leaving its borders dry, while the Tigris, bursting its bounds, overflowed the neighboring lands. The palace of Khosrau, the king of Persia, shook on its foundations, and several of its towers were toppled to the earth. In the same eventful night, the sacred fire of Zoroaster, which, guarded by the Magi, had burned without interruption for upwards of 1,000 years, was suddenly extinguished, and all the idols in the world fell down. Boy, the stuff y'all people don't come up with, huh? See, Muhammad and his successors. Now, I don't know if this is actual doctrine of the Islamic faith. They had to have pulled it from somewhere, and this is wild. I don't believe any of this, right? I don't believe that it is impossible that the lake shrunk back, right? There could have been drought. There could have been tidal effects. That is possible. This illuminated by this newborn child said, "I am his, there is no God but God, and I am his prophet," right? God is great. There is no God but God. And nobody knew about that until he just decided, after being a failed merchant, to found a religion. It wasn't until well after that that this was recognized by anybody. There's no accounts of this elsewhere. Like, this is the same as the whole nativity in the Bible. Like, it's just something added to give some extra credence, even though it probably almost certainly did not happen. While the prophet was still but a toddling babe, the angel Gabriel, with 70 wings, came to him, and cutting open the child, withdrew the heart. This Gabriel cleansed of the black drop of original sin which is in every human heart because of the perfidy of Adam, and then returned the organ to its proper place in the prophet's body. Is that real? Do they really believe that? That's wild. That's wild to me. That is absolutely wild to me. So this angel came down and cut out the heart of this child and cleansed it and put it back because, the heart actually holds the sin. Now, allegory, we don't read this as allegory, right? We didn't read the Bible as allegory, even though it is almost certainly allegory. We read it as if it were real, as if it was how it's meant to be done, how it's meant to be said. And if God was going to do this, once again, it would have been better recorded, right? Like, he didn't come and just immediately go into, hey, this is the proper way to do it, right? He was studying several other religions, and he took several pieces of several other religions and piecemealed them together into a new religion. He wasn't even shy about talking about that. Like, I don't know all of the intricate details, but that I know, right? That's wild. In his youth, Muhammad traveled with the Meccan caravans. On one occasion acted as an armor-bearer for his uncle, and spent a considerable amount of time among the Bedouins, from whom he learned many of the religious and philosophic traditions of Western Arabia. While traveling with his uncle, Abu Talib, Muhammad contacted the Nestorian Christians, having encamped on a certain night near one of their monasteries. Here, the young prophet-to-be secured much of his information concerning the origin and doctrines of the Christian faith. With the passing years, Muhammad attained marked success in business, and when about 26 years old, married one of his employers. That's always a mark of being successful. A wealthy widow, nearly 15 years of center, always a mark of being successful. The widow, Khadijah by name, was apparently somewhat mercenary, for, finding her young business manager most efficient, she resolved to retain him in that capacity for life. Khadijah was a woman of exceptional mentality, and to her integrity and devotion must be ascribed the early success of the Islamic cause. By his marriage, Muhammad was elevated from a position of comparative poverty to one of great wealth and power, so successful. And so exemplary was his conduct that he became known throughout Mecca as the faithful and true. And again, I don't have enough to expound upon most of this, but it has been fairly well reasonably assumed that when a young man marries an older wealthy woman, there's probably a reason for it, right? We can agree on that, right? Muhammad would have lived and died an honored and respected Meccan had he not unhesitatingly sacrificed both his wealth and social position in the service of God, whose voice he heard while meditating in the cavern on Mount Hira in the month of Ramadan. Year after year, Muhammad climbed the rocky and desolate slopes of Mount Hira, since called Jebel Nur, the Mountain of Light, and here, in his loneliness, cried out to God to reveal anew the pure religion of Adam, that spiritual doctrine lost to mankind through the dispensations of religious factions, or dissensions of religious factions. Khadijah, solicitous over her husband's ascetic practices, which were impairing his physical health, sometimes accompanied him in his weary vigil, and with womanly intuition sensed the travail of his soul. At last, one night in his 40th year, as he lay upon the floor of the cavern enveloped in his cloak, a great light burst out upon him. Overcome with a sense of perfect peace and understanding in the blessedness of the celestial presence, he lost consciousness. When he came to himself again, the angel Gabriel stood before him, exhibiting a silken shawl with mysterious characters traced upon it. From these characters, Muhammad gained the basic doctrines later embodied in the Quran. Then Gabriel spoke in a clear and wonderful voice, declaring Muhammad to be the prophet of the living God. In awe and trembling, Muhammad hastened to Khadijah, fearing the visions to have been inspired by the same evil spirits who served the pagan magicians so greatly despised by him. Khadijah assured him that his own virtuous life would be his protection, and that he needed fear no evil. Thus reassured, the prophet awaited further visitations from Gabriel. When these did not come, however, such a despair filled his soul that he attempted self-destruction, only to be stopped in the very act of casting himself over a cliff by the sudden reappearance of Gabriel, who again assured the prophet that the revelations needed by his people would be given to him as necessity arose. That's awfully convenient. Muhammad's journey to heaven, night journey to heaven. Hey, look, we got the black checkerboard, the black and white checkerboard. I wonder what that can mean. We haven't talked about that at all. From the Ascent Tableau Général de l'Empire Ottoman. In the 17th surah of the Quran, it is written that upon a certain night, Muhammad was transported from the temple at Mecca to that of Jerusalem, but no details are given of the strange journey. In the Mishkatu al-Mashabi, Muhammad is made to describe his ascent through the seven heavens into the icy presence of the many-veiled God, and his subsequent return to his own bed, all in a single night. Muhammad was awakened in the night by the angel Gabriel, who, after removing the prophet's heart, washed the cavity with Zamzam water, and filled the heart itself with faith and science. A strange creature, called Al-Barak, or the lightning bolt, was brought for the conveyance of the prophet. Al-Barak is described as a white animal in the shape and size of a mule, with the head of a woman and the tail of a peacock. According to some versions, Muhammad merely rode Al-Barak to Jerusalem, where, dismounting upon Mount Moriah, he caught hold of the lower rung of a golden ladder lowered from heaven, and accompanied by Gabriel, ascended through the seven spheres, separating the earth from the inner surface of the Empyrean. At the gate of each sphere stood one of the patriarchs, whom Muhammad saluted as he entered the various planes. At the gate of the first heaven stood Adam. At the gate of the second, John and Jesus, sisters' sons. At the third, Joseph. At the fourth, Enoch. At the fifth, Aaron. At the sixth, Moses. And at the seventh, Abraham. Another order of patriarchs and prophets is given, which places Jesus at the gate of the seventh heaven, And upon reaching this point, Muhammad is said to have requested Jesus to intercede for him before the throne of God. Possibly as a result of his lonely periods of meditation, Muhammad seemingly was subject to ecstatic swoons. On the occasions when the various surahs of the Quran were dictated, he is said to have fallen unconscious, and, regardless of the chill of the surrounding air, to have been covered with beads of perspiration. Often these attacks came without warning, and at other times he would sit wrapped in a blanket to prevent a chill from the copious perspiration. And while apparently unconscious, would dictate the various passages which a small circle of trusted friends would either commit to memory or reduce to writing. On one occasion, in later life, when Abu Bakr referred to the gray hairs in his beard, Muhammad, lifting up the end of his beard and looking at it, declared its whiteness to be due to the physical agony attendant upon his periods of inspiration. If the writings attributed to Muhammad be considered as merely the hallucinations of an epileptic, and for that reason discounted, his Christian detractors should beware lest with the doctrines of the prophet they also undermine the very teachings which they themselves affirm. For many of the disciples, apostles, and saints of the early church are known to have been subject to nervous disorders. Muhammad's first convert was his own wife, Khadijah, who was followed by other members of his immediate family, a circumstance which moved Sir William Weir to note. It is strongly corroborative of Muhammad's sincerity that the earliest converts to Islam were not only of upright character, but his own bosom friends and people of his household, who, intimately acquainted with his private life, could not fail otherwise to have detected those discrepancies which ever more or less exist between the professions of the hypocritical deceiver abroad and his actions at home. See The Secret Life of Muhammad. That doesn't mean anything. Jim Jones talked all kinds of people into drinking Kool-Aid. Among the first to accept the faith of Islam was Abu Bakr, who became Muhammad's closest and most faithful friend. In fact, his alter ego. Abu Bakr, a man of brilliant attainments, contributed materially to the success of the Prophet's enterprise, so he found a sugar daddy. And in accord with the express wish of the Prophet, became the leader of the faithful after Muhammad's death. Imagine that. Aisha, the daughter of Abu Bakr, later became the wife of Muhammad, thus still further cementing the bond of fraternity between the two men. Wasn't she the child? Right? Wasn't she the child? Like 7 or something? Quietly, but industriously, Muhammad promulgated his doctrines among a small circle of powerful friends. When the enthusiasm of his followers finally forced his hand, and he publicly announced his mission, he was already the leader of a strong and well-organized faction. Fearing Muhammad's growing prestige, the people of Mecca, waiving the time-honored tradition that blood could not be spilled within the holy city, decided to exterminate Islam by assassinating the Prophet. All the different groups combined in this undertaking so that the guilt for the crime may thereby be more evenly distributed. Discovering the danger in time, Muhammad left his friend Ali in his bed and fled with Abu Bakr from the city. After the adroitly eluding the Meccans, joined the main body of his followers that had preceded him from Yathrib, afterwards called Medina. Upon his incident, called the Hijra, or flight, is based the Islamic chronological system. Dating from the Hijra, the power of the Prophet steadily grew until in the 8th year of Muhammad, Muhammad entered Mecca after practically a bloodless victory and established it as the spiritual center of his faith. Planting his standard to the north of Mecca, he rode into the city, and after circling 7 times the sacred Kaaba, ordered the 360 images within its precincts to be hewn down. He then entered the Kaaba itself, cleansed it of its idolatrous associations, and rededicated the structure to Allah, the monotheistic God of Islam. Muhammad next granted amnesty to all his enemies for their attempts to destroy him. Under his protection, Mecca increased in power and glory, becoming the focal point of the great annual pilgrimage, which even to this day winds across the desert in the months of the pilgrimage and numbers over 3,000 in its train. And a lot of people go for, what is it called? I used to know. It'll come to me eventually, but in the 10th year after the Hijra, Muhammad led the valedictory pilgrimage and for the last time rode at the head of the faithful along the sacred way leading to Mecca and the Black Stone. As the premonition of death was strong upon him, he desired this pilgrimage to be the perfect model for all the thousands that would follow. Conscious that life was waning away within him, writes Washington Irving, Muhammad, during his last sojourn in the sacred city of his faith, sought to engrave his doctrines deeply in the minds and hearts of his followers. For this purpose he preached frequently in the Kaaba from the pulpit or in the open air from the back of his camel. Listen to my words, would he say, for I know not whether after this year we shall ever meet here again. O my hearers, I am but a man like yourself. The angel of death may at any time appear, and I must obey his summons. While thus preaching, the very heavens were said to have opened, and the voice of God spoke, saying, This day I have perfected your religion, and accomplished in you my grace. When these words were uttered, the multitude fell down in adoration, and even Muhammad's camel knelt. See Muhammad and his successors. Having completed the valedictory pilgrimage, Muhammad returned to Medina. In the 7th year after the Hijra, an attempt was made at Kaaba to poison the Prophet. As Muhammad took the first mouthful of the poisoned food, the evil design was revealed to him, either by the taste of the meat or, as the faithful believe, by divine intercession. He had already swallowed a small portion of the food, however, and for the remainder of his life he suffered almost constantly from the effects of the poison. In A.H. 11, when his final illness came upon him, Muhammad insisted that the subtle effects of the poison were the indirect cause of his approaching end. It is related that during his last sickness he rose one night and visited a burial ground on the outskirts of Medina, evidently believing that he too would soon be numbered with the dead. At this time he told an attendant that the choice had been offered him of continuing his physical life or going to his Lord, and that he had chosen to meet his Maker. Muhammad suffered greatly with his head and side and also from fever, but on June 8th seemed convalescent. He joined his followers in prayer, and seating himself in the courtyard, delivered a lecture to the faithful in a clear and powerful voice. Apparently he overtaxed his strength, for it was necessary to assist him into the house of Aisha, which opened into the court of the mosque. Here, upon a tough pallet laid on the bare floor, the Prophet of Islam spent his last 2 hours on earth. When she saw that her aged husband was suffering intense pain, Aisha, then but a girl of 20, lifting the gray head of the man she had known from infancy and who must have seemed more like a father than a husband, supported him in her arms until the end. Feeling that death was upon him, Muhammad prayed, O Lord, I beseech thee, assist me in the agonies of death. Then, almost in a whisper, he repeated 3 times, Gabriel, come close unto me. For details, consult The Life of Muhammad by Sir William Muir. In The Hero as Prophet, Thomas Carlyle writes thus of the death of Muhammad. His last words were a prayer, broken ejaculations of a heart struggling up in trembling hope towards its Maker. Muhammad was buried under the floor of the apartment in which he died. The present condition of the grave is thus described. Above the Hujra is a green dome, surmounted by a large gilt crescent springing from a series of globes. Within the building are the tombs of Muhammad, Abu Bakr, and Umar, with a space reserved for the grave of our Lord Jesus Christ, who Muslims say will again visit the earth and die and be buried at Al-Madinah. The grave of Fatima, the Prophet's daughter, is supposed to be in a separate part of the building, although some say she was buried in Baqi. The Prophet's body is said to be stretched full length on the right side, with the right palm supporting the right cheek, the face fronting Mecca. Close behind him is placed Abu Bakr, whose face fronts Muhammad's shoulder, and then Umar, who occupies the same position with respect to his predecessor. Among Christian historians, there is a popular story to the effect that Mohammedans believe the coffin of their prophet to be suspended in the air, which has no foundation whatever in Muslim literature, and Niebuhr thinks that the story must have arisen from the rude pictures sold to strangers. See A Dictionary of Islam. Concerning the character of Muhammad, there have been the grossest misconceptions. No evidence exists to support the charges of extreme cruelty and licentiousness laid at his door. I don't know of those, so I can't argue either way. On the other hand, the more closely the life of Muhammad is scrutinized by dispassionate investigators, the more apparent become the finer qualities of his nature, in the words of Carlyle. I do believe we are seeing a bit of bias in this writing. I'm just saying. Muhammad himself, after all that can be said about him, was not a sensual man. We err widely if we consider this man as a common voluptuary, intent mainly on his base enjoyments, nay, on enjoyments of any kind. His household was of the frugalest, his common diet barley, bread, and water. Sometimes for a month there was not a fire once lighted upon his hearth. A poor, hard-working, ill-provided man, careless of what vulgar man toiled for. They called him a prophet, you say? Why, he stood there face to face with them, there, not enshrined in any mystery, visibly clouding his own cloak, cobbling his own shoes, fighting, counseling, ordering in the midst of them. They must have seen what kind of man he was. Let him be called what you like. No emperor with his tiaras was obeyed as this man in a cloak of his own clouting. And I would make the argument that some of the evidences here are actually evidences that you are on the wrong path. Confused by the apparent hopeless task of reconciling the life of the prophet with the absurd statements long accepted as authentic, Washington Irving raised him on the scales of fairness. Oh my God. His military triumphs awakened no pride or vainglory, as they would have done had they been effected for selfish purposes. In the time of his greatest power, he maintained the same simplicity of manners and appearances as in the days of his adversity. It is this perfect abnegation of self, connected with this apparent heartfelt piety running throughout the various phases of his fortune, which perplex one in forming a just estimate of Muhammad's character. When he hung over the deathbed of his infant son Ibrahim, resignation to the will of God was exhibited in his conduct under the keenest of afflictions, and the hope of soon rejoining his child in paradise was his consolation. See Muhammad and his successors. Aisha, questioned after the death of the prophet concerning his habits, replied that he mended his own clothes, cobbled his own shoes, and helped her in the household duties. How far removed from Western concepts of Muhammad's sanguinary character is Aisha's simple admission that he loved most of all to sew. He also accepted the invitations of slaves and sat at meals with servants, declaring himself to be a servant. Of all vices, he hated lying the most. Before his death, he freed all his slaves. Convenient. He never permitted his family to use for personal ends any of the alms or tithe money given by his people. He was fond of sweetmeats and used rainwater for drinking purposes. His time he divided into 3 parts, namely, the first he gave to God, the second to his family, and the third part to himself. The latter portion, however, he later sacrificed to the service of his people. He dressed chiefly in white, but also wore red, yellow, and green. Muhammad entered Mecca wearing a black turban and bearing a black standard. He wore only the plainest of garments, declaring that rich and conspicuous raiment did not become the pious, and did not remove his shoes at prayer. He was particularly concerned with the cleanliness of his teeth, and at the time of his death, when too weak to speak, indicated his desire for a toothpick. When fearful of forgetting something, the prophet tied a thread to his ring. He once had a very fine gold ring, but noting that his followers had taken to wearing similar rings in emulation of him, he removed his own and threw it away, lest his followers form an evil habit. See the life of Muhammad. The most frequent and apparently the most damaging accusation brought against Muhammad is that of polygamy. Those who sincerely believe the harem to be irreconcilable with spirituality should, with consistency, move for the expurgation of the Psalms of David and the Proverbs of Solomon from the lack of inspired writings. I agree. For the harem of Islam's prophet was insignificant compared with that maintained by Israel's wisest king and the reputed favorite of the Most High. The popular conception that Muhammad taught that woman had no soul and could attain heaven only through marriage is not substantiated by the words and attitude of the prophet during his lifetime. In a paper entitled The Influence of Islam on Social Conditions, read at the World's Parliament of Religions, held in Chicago in 1893, Muhammad Webb states the charge and answered it thus. I'm going to pause just for a second to talk about this. This guy and this guy, David and Solomon, are no examples to follow, right? We've talked about that extensively. The Psalms are attributed to David. Whether or not he wrote them is up for grabs. Some of them possibly, all of them probably not. The Proverbs of Solomon were him recording other people's sayings, and so there is that. But the three books that he wrote, one was the Song of Songs, one was Ecclesiastes, and the other was Proverbs, have to deal with things, but Solomon again was no example to follow. David was a very horrible person throughout the entirety of his life, up to and including his death, with no reasonable expectation of any conversion from that. He was rewarded quite extensively for doing horrible things. And the same is true for Solomon, who quite explicitly broke the will of God in his main means of supporting his kingdom. If you do not know what I'm talking about, I highly recommend that you check out the Unconventional Bible Study and pay particular attention to both Chronicles and Kings. Now, for the quote. It has been said that Muhammad and the Quran denied a soul to woman and ranked her with the animals. The Quran places her on a perfect and completely equality with man, and the Prophet's teachings often place her in a position superior to the male in some respects. Again, I do not have the extensive knowledge of the Quran to make statements as to whether this is in there or not. Mr. Webb justifies his stand by quoting from the 35th verse of the 33rd surah of the Quran. And we will come back to that after the illustration. This is the Kaaba, the holy place of Islam. From a section from Panorama of Mecca in Deson's Tableau General d'Empire Ottoman. The Kaaba, or cube-shaped building in the midst of a great court of the mosque at Mecca, is the most holy spot in the Islamic world. Toward it, the followers of the Prophet must face 5 times a day at the appointed hours of prayer. Like the devotees of nearly all other faiths, the Muslim originally faced east while in prayer, but by a later degree he was ordered to turn his face towards Mecca. Little is known of the history of the Kaaba prior to its rededication as a Mohammedan mosque, other than that the building was a pagan temple. At the time the Prophet captured Mecca, the Kaaba and surrounding court contained 360 idols, which were destroyed by Muhammad before he actually gained access to the shrine itself. The ancient house, as the Kaaba is called, is an irregular cube measuring about 38 feet in length, 35 feet in height, and 30 feet in width, so not a cube at all. The length of the side of each wall varies slightly. At the ends of the walls, in walls over a foot. In the southeast corner of the wall, at a convenient distance above the ground, about 5 feet, is embedded the sacred and mysterious black stone, or areolite of Abraham. When first given to that patriarch by the angel Gabriel, this stone was of such strong whiteness as to be visible from every part of the earth. But late it became black because of the sins of man. This black stone, oval in shape and about 7 inches in diameter, was broken in the 7th century and is now held together by a silver mounting. According to tradition, 2,000 years before the creation of the world, the Kaaba was first constructed in heaven, where a model where a model of it still remains. Adam erected the Kaaba on earth exactly below the spot in heaven occupied by the original, and selected the stones from the 5 sacred mountains: Sinai, Al-Judai, Hira, Olivet, and Lebanon. 10,000 angels were appointed to guard the structure. At the time of the deluge, the sacred house was destroyed, but afterwards was rebuilt by Abraham and his son Ishmael. For details, see a Dictionary of Islam. It is probable that the site of the Kaaba was originally occupied by a prehistoric stone altar, or ring of uncut monoliths, similar to those of Stonehenge, self-insertion, like the temple at Jerusalem. Like the temple at Jerusalem, the Kaaba has undergone many vicissitudes, and the present structure does not antedate the 17th century of the Christian era. When Mecca was sacked in AD 930, the famous black stone was captured by the Carmathians, in whose possession it remained over 20 years, and it is a moot question whether the stone finally returned by them in exchange for a princely ransom was actually the original block or a substitute. The site of the Kaaba are the supposed graves of Hagar and Ishmael, and near the door, which is about 7 feet above the ground, is the stone upon which Abraham stood while rebuilding the Kaaba. Various coverings have always been thrown over the cube-shaped structure. The present drape, which is replaced annually, is a black brocade embroidered in a gold. Small pieces at the old drape are cherished by pilgrims as holy relics. Entrance to the Kaaba is effected by a movable flight of steps. The interior is lined with varicolored marble, silver, and gilt. Although the building is generally conceived to be windowless, this point is disputed. Access to the roof is had through a silver-plated door. In addition to the sacred books, the Kaaba contains 13 lamps. The great courtyard around the building contains a number of holy objects and is bounded by a colonnade which originally consisted of 360 pillars. Opening into the courtyard are 19 gates, the sacred and significant number of the Metonic cycle, and also the number of stones in the inner ring of Stonehenge. 7 great minarets tower above the Kaaba, and one of the sacred ceremonials in connection with the building includes 7 circumambulations about the central Kaaba in an apparent effort to portray the motion of the celestial bodies. All right. Back to the text. Verily, the Muslims of either sex, and the true believers of either sex, and the devout men and the devout women, and the men of veracity and the women of veracity, and the patient men and the patient women, and the humble men and the humble women, and the almsgivers of either sex, and the men who fast and the women who fast, and the chaste men and the chaste women, and those of either sex, who remember Allah frequently. For them hath Allah prepared forgiveness and a great reward. Here, the attainment of heaven is clearly set forth as a problem whose only solution is that of individual merit. On the day of his death, Muhammad told Fatima, his beloved daughter, and Sophia, his aunt, Work ye out that which shall gain acceptance for you with the Lord, for I verily have no power with him to save you in any way. The Prophet did not advise either woman to rely upon the virtues of her husband, nor in any manner did he indicate woman's salvation to be dependent upon the human frailty of her spouse. Everything to the contrary notwithstanding, Muhammad is not responsible for the contradictions and inconsistencies in the Quran, for the volume was not compiled and did not assume its present form until over 20 years after his death. In its present state, the Quran is, for the most part, a jumble of hearsay, through which occasionally shines forth an example of true inspiration. Or, as I like to say all the way through the Bible study, despite the best efforts of man, the will of God will shine through. From what is known of the man Muhammad, it is reasonable to suppose that these nobler and finer portions represent the actual doctrines of the Prophet. The remainder are obvious interpolations, some arising from misunderstandings, and others direct forgeries calculated to satisfy the temporal ambitions of conquering Islam. On this subject, Godfrey Higgins speaks with his usual perspicacity. Here we have the Quran of Muhammad and the first four sincere and zealous patriarchs, and the Quran of the conquering and magnificent Saracens, puffed up with pride and vanity. The Quran of the eclectic philosopher was not likely to suit the conquerors of Asia. A new one must be grafted in the old to find a justification for their enormities. See Anacalypsis. To the discerning few, it is evident that Muhammad had a great knowledge of that secret doctrine which must needs constitute the core of every great philosophical, religious, or ethical institution. Through one of the four possible avenues, Muhammad may have contacted the ancient mystery teachings. One, through direct contact with the great school of the invisible world, through the Nestorian Christian monks, through the mysterious holy men who appeared and disappeared at frequent intervals during the period in which the surahs of the Quran were revealed, through a decadent school already existing in Arabia, which school, in spite of its lapse into idolatry, still retained the secrets of the ancient wisdom cult. The arcana of Islam may yet be demonstrated to have been directly founded upon the ancient pagan mysteries performed at the Kaaba centuries before the birth of the Prophet. In fact, it is generally admitted that many of the ceremonials now embodied in the Islamic mysteries are survivals of pagan Arabia. The feminine principle is repeatedly emphasized in Islamic symbolism. For example, Friday, which is sacred to the planet Venus, is the Muslims' holy day. Green is the color of the Prophet, and being symbolic of verdure is inevitably associated with the World Mother. And both the Islamic crescent and the scimitar may be interpreted to signify the crescent shape of either the moon or Venus. All right, so to say that them using Friday and that these people believe that that's feminine, so they're obviously using the feminine energy as a stretch, right? That is some self-insertion here. It may be true. It absolutely could be true that the days are gendered. I doubt it very seriously, but it is entirely possible. There is no, as far as I know, there is no reason to believe that Muhammad believed that Friday was a feminine day and therefore we're going to worship on Friday. Right? There's no way to believe. Like, Friday, Frida's Day, is based off of Norse mythology, which is separated by at least 1,000 miles, right? There's a long distance in them days, and it's a long distance in these days, but much less in them days. And so I find it hard to believe that they worship on Friday because the goddess Freya is worshipped in Scandinavia. I really find that hard to believe. I mean, that's some self-insertion on a wild level. The green being associated with the World Mother, that is a thing, but it is also the symbol of the heart, which is the binding together of the lower nature of man and the upper nature of man into the heart and into the divine. So it could signify that as well. The crescent shape, the moon is prevalent. There are many different reasons why that could be and why it is, and I don't know enough to expound upon that particular part, but I have to point out the possibility for self-insertion at a minimum. The famous Stone of Kaaba, Kabir or Kabir, at Mecca, says Jennings, which is so devoutly kissed by the faithful, is a talisman. It is said that the figure of Venus is seen to this day engraved upon it with a crescent. This very Kaaba itself was at first an idolatrous temple, and still is, where the Arabians worshipped Al-Muzah, God and Issa, that is Venus. See Kennelly's Enoch, the second messenger of God. Right, I'm not a big one for the veneration of the tools, right? There are various tools. This is a tool right here. This is a stone. It is a tool. I have another stone right here. It is a tool. I have another stone right here. It is a tool. There are various ones back here. They are also tools. None of them have power in and of themselves. No tool has power in and of itself, and kissing any tool is not going to do anything for you. It's just not. The Mussulmans, writes Sir William Jones, are all not of in and of itself. You can imbue power through the kiss, and that is a whole different thing. It doesn't have power by itself. The Mussulmans, writes Sir William Jones, are already a sort of heterodox Christians. They are Christians, if Rock reasons justly, because they firmly believe the Immaculate Conception. That's not my understanding. Divine character and miracles of the Messiah, but they are heterodox in denying vehemently his character of Son, and his equality as God with the Father, of whose unity and attributes they entertain and express the most awful ideas, while they consider our doctrine as perfect blasphemy, and insist that our copies of Scriptures have been corrupted by both Jews and Christians. They are not wrong. The following lines are declared by the followers of the prophet to have been deleted from the Christian Gospels. And when Jesus, the Son of Mary, said, O children of Israel, verily I am the apostle of God sent unto you, confirming the law which was delivered before me, and bringing good tidings of an apostle who shall come after me, and whose name shall be Ahmed. In the present text containing the prophecy of Jesus concerning a comforter to come after him, it is further claimed that the word comforter should be translated illustrious, and that it had direct reference to Muhammad. Also, that the tongues of flame that descended upon the apostles on the day of Pentecost in no way could be interpreted to signify the promised comforter. When asked, however, for definite proof that the original Gospels contain these so-called expurgated references to Muhammad, the Muslims make a counter-demand for production of the original documents upon which Christianity is founded. Until such writings are discovered, the point under dispute must remain a source of controversy. To ignore the heritage of culture received from Islam would be an unpardonable oversight, for when the crescent triumphed over the cross in southern Europe, it was the harbinger of a civilization which had no equal in its day. In Studies in a Mosque, Stanley Lane Poole writes, For nearly 8 centuries under her Mohammedan rulers, Spain set to all Europe a shining example of a civilized and enlightened state. Art, literature, and science prospered as they then prospered nowhere else in Europe. Students flocked from France and Germany and England to drink from the fountains of learning which flowed only in the cities of the Moors. The surgeons and doctors of Andalusia were in the van of science. Women were encouraged to devote themselves to serious study, and a lady doctor was not unknown among the people of Cordova. Mathematics, astronomy, and botany, history, philosophy, and jurisprudence were to be mastered in Spain and in Spain alone. The Library of Original Sources thus sums up the effect of Islam. The results of Mohammedanism have been greatly underestimated. In the century after Muhammad's death, it wrested Asia Minor, Africa, and Spain from Christianity, more than half of the civilized world, and established a civilization, the highest in the world during the Dark Ages. It brought the Arabian race to their highest development, raised the position of women in the East, though it retained polygamy, was intensely monotheistic, and until the Turks regained control, for the most part encouraged progress. In the same work, among the great Islamic scientists and philosophers who have made substantial contributions to human knowledge are listed Gerber or Jafir, who in the 9th century laid the foundations for modern chemistry, Ben Musa, who in the 10th century introduced the theory of algebra, Al-Hazi, who in the 11th century made a profound study of optics and discovered the magnifying power of convex lenses. And in the 11th century, also, both Avicenna, or Ibn Sina, whose medical encyclopedia was the standard of his age, and the great Kabbalist Avis Baran, or Ibn Jabirol. Looking back on the science of the Mohammedans, resumes the authority just quoted, it will be seen that they laid the first foundations of chemistry and made important advances in mathematics and optics. Their discoveries never had the influence they should have had upon the course of European civilization. But this was because Europe itself was not enlightened enough to grasp and make use of them. Gerber's observation that oxidized iron weighs heavier than before oxidation had to be made over again. So had some of their work in optics and many of their geographical discoveries. They had rounded Africa long before Vasco da Gama. The composition of gunpowder came into northern Europe from them. We must never forget that the Dark Ages in Christian Europe were the bright ones in the Mohammedan world. Not necessarily unrelated. In the field of philosophy, the Arabs started by adopting the Neoplatonism they found in Europe and gradually working back to Aristotle. What means the subtle mystery of the phoenix reborn every 600 years? That's close, but it's not quite. You're missing a zero. Faintly, from within the sanctuary of the world mysteries is whispered the answer. 600 years before Christ, the phoenix of wisdom, Pythagoras, spread its wings and died upon the altar of humanity. No, consumed by the sacrificial fire. In Nazareth, the bird was again reborn from its own ashes, only to die upon the tree which had its roots in Adam's skull. In AD 60 appeared Muhammad. Again, the phoenix suffered, this time from the poison of Kaaba, and from its charred ashes rose to spread its wings across the face of Mongolia, where in the 12th century Genghis Khan established the rule of wisdom. Is that what he did? Circling the mighty desert of Gobi, the phoenix again gave up its form, which now lies buried in a glass sarcophagus under a pyramid, bearing upon it the ineffable figures of the mysteries. After the lapse of 600 years from the death of Genghis Khan, did Napoleon Bonaparte, who believed himself to be the man of destiny, contact in his wanderings this strange legend of the continual, periodic rebirth of wisdom? Did he feel the spreading wings of the phoenix within himself? And did he believe the hope of the world had taken flesh in him? The eagle on his standard may well have been the phoenix. This would explain why he was moved to believe himself predestined to establish the kingdom of Christ on earth, and is, perhaps, the clue to his little understand friendliness towards the Muslim. Okay, and so that is going to wrap this one up, and there is a good bit here to talk about. Not the least of which is the phoenix. Now, I believe in a cycle. It is a 12,000 year cycle, but it has 6,000 year counterparts. This 600 is probably supposed to be 6,000, in my estimation. There are other people that have other numbers. There's somebody out there with 138. They think that there is a destructive cycle every 138 years. I don't find the proof to be there as extensively as is claimed in some of the cases given forth as evidence thereof. It is entirely possible, however, that there are other cycles. Right? I believe in the big one because it is more easily proven. There is records of it we dealt with in Timaeus and Critias, which were the writings of Plato, about Atlantis and how there was recorded then a cycle that repeats. I believe that 12,000 years ago there was a cycle of burning, and that 6,000 years ago there was a cycle of water, and now 6,000 years from that there will be a cycle of burning. 6,000 years from that there will be another cycle of flood. And so it is a hot and a wet, and a hot and a wet. That's what I call it. I believe that that is a thing, that is imminent, right? It could happen tomorrow, but it's more likely 20 to 30 years down the road, according to various other reasons, which is too long to really even get into here. I do believe that that is a thing, right? This Phoenix event where the earth is reborn, I believe happens. Once it happens from fire, and then once it happens from water, but it happens twice in the cycle before the cycle repeats. We are at the repeating part of the cycle where the fire. So I believe that this is 6,000 years from the flood, that where we are now is right at 6,000 years. That plays into various other things as well. And so I do believe that there is something coming. It doesn't necessarily have to be what is outlined here, right? This can be a cycle. I don't necessarily hold it to be true, but it can be, right? I don't attribute wisdom to Genghis Khan, right? He was a conqueror, and maybe there was some wisdom in that, but not necessarily. I don't to Alexander the Great either, right? I don't attribute to these people who attempted to take over the world greatness. That is not the goal of what we are to do. We are to be an example to the world. And if the entire world wants to imitate that, then fine. But we are not to go out and bring peace through the use of the sword. We are not to go out and conquer. Right? We are to conquer the earth, not the inhabitants thereof. They were forbidden to shed the blood of men, except in extreme case of self-defense. That is an acceptable use, but it is extreme cases. It is not the preferable excuse. You are not meant to go forth and conquer people for your religion. And if you do that, you are doing it wrong. It doesn't matter what religion it is. I do believe that there are things that are written down that are true, and I do believe that there are things that are written down that are absolutely untrue. I have 161 videos in the Bible study, and we go through in some extensive detail the hypocrisy involved in there. We repeatedly say that despite the best efforts of man, God's will shines through. There are several examples of direct contradictions within the same chapters of what is supposed to happen or how it happens or God being confused or all kinds of problems. I am sure that there is the same types of problems inside the Quran, even though I have not extensively studied it, right? I'm not claiming to be an expert. I'm not here to insult your religion, even though you're probably going to take it that way. I hold some unconventional beliefs. I fully believe in God, 1,000%. I know that is mathematically impossible. I believe with every fiber in my being in the sovereignty of God himself, but I do not believe that anybody who came telling you things has at the very minimum been recorded correctly. Even if they said it correctly, I don't believe it was recorded correctly. I do not believe that any of the written procedures are correct. I do not believe that any of the accounts are without at least a little bit of malice and ill intention. And that is just where I am. I believe that God is all things. He is everything at once. And that he does not incarnate here. There is no Son of God here other than that we are all sons of God. I believe that the divinity that was in Christ, he told you explicitly, was in you too. I believe it is. I believe it's the soul. It is the part of God that he allows you to use to make the decisions of free will here on this planet, which is not a prison planet. I hold some unconventional beliefs, and it is not intentional for me to step on toes when I relay them, but I do not apologize for them, regardless of whose toes I step upon. If it is my time to go home, God is going to take me home, whether that is by a sword or a meteor, whether it's a heart attack or a stroke. No matter what it is, I am here to stand 10 toes down where I need to stand. And if that offends you, it is what it is. You know what happens when you get offended? Your blood pressure goes up, and that's it. Now, you can choose to take action, and I'm once again going to remind you that I am not restricted from self-defense in the way that Christians are. I am not obligated to do things in the manner in which they do it because I am not following the same rules. I follow the 8 laws of creation to a T, and you can bet that self-defense is very firmly embedded in there. So that's where I'm going to go ahead and wrap this one up. Hopefully I brought a little bit of enlightenment and not too much confusion. I try to talk about the things I know about, and I try not to talk about the things I don't know about. This is not an intentional slight at anybody's religion, but if you want to take it that way, you're more than welcome to. If you like what I'm doing over here, let me know down below. Give me a like, share, and a sub. Throw me a comment, and if you agree or disagree, if it remains respectful, it gets to remain up. And if you really like what I'm doing, hit me with that super thanks because I am not a communist. To the crew, thanks for hanging out. I appreciate every single minute that you are here with me, and I am praying for you every single day. Until next time, I love you. God loves you. You are perfect, whole, and complete just the way that you are. And this has been Pitt State. Peace.